So, okay, so welcome to the first evening of this go around of the Atlantic School of Discipleship. Delighted to have you with us. Um, as I was mentioning earlier, the numbers and registrations continue to come in as church life begins again in the fall. So there are about twice as many people already registered as are on the call tonight, and so there may be more. So we'll grow and welcome people as they come along. Thank you for joining this, and just to remind you of what I put in the email that hopefully all of you received, that the normal pattern will be that at the beginning of the month, you'll receive some background material or suggested readings and focus questions from our instructors. And then on the second and the fourth Tuesday evenings, we'll meet in this fashion for time with our guest instructor. And they're they're free to structure the time as they want and to give us breaks and do whatever they wish for us. And so we'll be a couple of hours, and each month will be contained within a module will be contained within a month, and all of the materials that are generated will be available to you on the Atlantic School of Discipleship website for a full year, and I'll be sending you the passcode for that, the password for that in the next few days. So that's essentially what we're about, and you can always reach me with questions and so on. So as we begin our journey, I invite you to join me in prayer. We thank you, God, of new beginnings, for this new beginning, for this new community you've gathered in this virtual space. We thank you for those who are here and for those who are not yet joining with us, but who have indicated that they intend to, and for those who might still be discerning your invitation to be part of this journey of learning. We thank you for the traditions that we inherit. We thank you for the communities of which we are a part, and we look forward eagerly as you, through the skills of instructors, will guide us in our growth in discipleship and our following of your Son, Jesus, in whose name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So, for our first evening, I am delighted to welcome my friend and colleague, Susan McAlpine-Gillis. Susan is a United Church minister with many years of experience in the congregation and lots of experience in teaching, and she is currently the academic dean at the Atlantic School of Theology. And so she's going to be helping us think about caring in community. So Susan, so glad to have you with us again. Thank you. You always seem to be willing to say yes when I come up with crazy ideas. So take it away.
Thanks, Ross, and lovely to see all of you. Some of you I know really quite well, and others our paths have certainly crossed over the years. So it is really my pleasure to join you tonight. I had said to Ross, I don't mind starting in September. Sure, if you need someone to do the opening module, I can do that. And then all of a sudden September arrived, and it's like, oh my goodness, I guess I should really think about that. But as Ross said, I am currently serving as the academic dean at AST. I was ordained in the United Church of Canada in 1985, which is a long time ago now. I got a lovely letter from the moderator that said, "Congratulations on 40 years," back in the spring. And I've served in congregational ministry full time for 31 years. 26 of those were in Cole Harbour, or then Cole Harbour Woodside. And from the gathering of folks on the screen, we could have probably held this gathering pretty much in person somewhere on the Dartmouth side, and nobody would have had to travel very far to come and to be with us. Um, I transitioned back in 2017 out of full-time congregational ministry into work at AST and have been delighted to be there. But in the 26 years that I served in Cole Harbour, I was really privileged to work with a pastoral care team throughout all of those years. And so that ministry of pastoral care, that responsibility of caring for one another, certainly didn't just fall on my shoulders as the clergy person in the congregation. It was something that we engaged in together. And actually, back in 1990, gosh, that's a long time ago now, but in 1990, it was actually quite unusual for congregations to have pastoral care teams. It was just kind of an evolving process where that ministry of pastoral care was being shared more specifically. Now, there was a tradition that elders within the United Church took on a role of pastoral care. Unfortunately, even from the time I was ordained in 1985 and in years coming, that responsibility was kind of ebbing away from elders. And so there was, I think, a more focused um, process of trying to discern who has the gift of pastoral care because it is a spiritual gift, that gift of compassion and deep listening. But I was blessed to work with a team of folks through my years in Cole Harbour Woodside, and from them I learned a lot, and I hope they learned something from me in that process. So, in our time together tonight, I would like us to think about kind of 5 questions around how we care for each other in community to sort of explore those together. And I'm really open to your questions and your insights and your direction. So the 5 kind of well-known questions are, why do we do what we do? When do we offer it? What does it look like? Where do we offer it? And how do we do it? So when we think about that discipleship of caring for one another, why? Why do we do that? When? When do we do it? What does it look like? Where does it happen? How do we do it? And that's a lot to cover in a couple of hours. We could spend many days together doing that. But I'm interested first, as we start, I'd really like to understand what you are most interested in focusing on this evening. And so I appreciated our introductions in terms of where you're from and what kinds of things you're about. But when it comes to pastoral care or caring for one another in community, are there particular things that you're wanting to focus on, or if you had the opportunity to read some of the background material? There were 2 chapters from books on pastoral care, and then a whole series of just kind of things to think about, things to remember. Is there anything that you are really hoping that we might cover tonight? So maybe I can just sort of go around the room. Michael, is there anything from your perspective that you're wanting to talk about or learn about?
Uh, not really. I don't think I have the gift for, pastoral care in that sense. But I think I feel strongly that it's important that our communities of faith uh, are caring for the people around us. And I don't just mean the people in our communities of faith, but also
Right,
in the world, out in the world. And so, hopefully we'll touch on some of that. I know there are things that I try and do when I'm out in the world to show some love for people that might
right.
need it, but it's definitely not my strong suit. So,
Okay. Thanks for that honesty, Michael. I think you're probably better at it than you think, but that's okay. Gail, are there things you were hoping that might get looked at tonight? And again, you have to unmute yourself, darling. Yep.
I'm not used to using this Zoom platform. Sorry.
No problem.
Um, when I think of pastoral care, okay, like I think like we had a pastoral care team that went out, excuse me, went out to individuals. But when I think of pastoral care in the community, I think we all are at some point and should be involved in a community pastoral care as opposed to sort of being on a committee, which is fine, and I understand that, and it's wonderful. But I think as individuals, we should practice that in our own community. Not only in our church community, which is very easy to do, okay, but outside of our church community, like in our neighborhoods or in our workplace or things like that.
Okay, thanks, Gail. Jerry, what about you?
I'm very disappointed Gail went before me.
Oh, you can say ditto.
Gail, no, I won't say ditto. But she absolutely captured my perspective of pastoral care, and my thought that it's not a committee's or ministerial responsibility, but a community responsibility, and that we need to practice pastoral care in all aspects of our ministry. And Bonnie would be able to attest to the pastoral care that we as a community, choir community have. And that as you involve yourself, whether it's with men's work, UCW, a pastoral care team, a council, each does in its own way its pastoral care. I'm interested in learning more about the skill sets of listening. Certainly something that I could continue to develop and learn and grow in. And I guess that's what I'll say for now. I look at pastoral care as how we can create it as a culture in our churches, not as a committee.
Okay, great. That's helpful. Karen, I'll pop to you. Anything you're hoping to focus on?
I can't think of anything right at the moment.
Okay, that's fine. You're along for the ride. You'll learn,
Yeah.
and feel free to ask any questions, for sure. Winalda, I know you mentioned stewardship. What is it about is there anything about pastoral care that you're wanting to focus on or learn about?
I'm using the pastoral care course as a bit of a refresher. I think it's 3 years ago when the region introduced the Ottawa Pastoral Care Training Program, which was by Zoom, and that was a 10-week course. And they do, or 10-hour, they do advances also yearly. So this course will be like a refresher in terms for the pastoral care part.
Okay, great. That's super. Bonnie, thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of do want to springboard and ditto off of Gail and Jerry there. But something that I'm thinking of as we're talking about this is I read through some of the material given out early on. I didn't get through everything, but one thing that stuck out to me was kind of like protection of self and self-care to be able to actually provide care to others without kind of like burning out.
Right.
Is something that would be of value to me. Just if there's anything there, I find I can easily get overwhelmed and burnt out, and I'd rather. Then you can't really serve others when you're not able to when you're not filled as well.
Absolutely. Really, really, really important to think about our own boundaries when it comes to what we can give to others, because you cannot give from an empty cup. So how do you refill yourself spiritually and in your own walk with God so that you can then live out that call to care for others? Because if you give and give and give and give and never take time for yourself, it ends badly. So
Mm.
we will talk a little bit about that for sure. Barb,
Well, I didn't get a chance to read anything. I didn't
that's
get,
okay.
so I don't know what is in the material. My experience with uh, pastoral care committees is very limited.
Okay.
And one of the, well, I've been a church member for a long time. And over those years, although many different things have happened to my family, not a whole lot of times did somebody from the church reach out. So what I find is that somehow or another, we don't care well for our own community. And yes, the other part of it, and it's Ross's fault because he keeps putting these ideas in people's heads, is that we don't really know our community around us. I mean, we off at our church, we have church suppers. We are very, we do various different things, but I don't know that we know who is in our community. And in my particular case, I lived like I could throw rocks at a church near me, but nobody from that church has ever approached me. So, like, I know that there are things that I need to learn and we need to figure out, because I also at the same time belong to another organization, which is essentially a self-help group, but we're there for anybody. And I'm on, the outward facing phone line and the email, and answer questions and reach out to people. So I know a little of some of this stuff, but I don't know how to do it at the church,
Okay.
if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, that's really that's interesting stuff for us to think about, for sure. How do we, I mean, the ancient word around that is evangelism. How do we take our good news to the world in a way that we practice it with love and compassion, right? And often church people are more than a little bit afraid to talk about where um, where their motivation for compassion and care comes from. And when we talk about discipleship, I think we need to be talking about that active following of Jesus as the reason or the motivation. Not that we expect other people to believe likewise, but to know what our motivation is in that instance. So sure. Neil, you are.
Well, I guess I have to agree with Mike. Not the part about not being suited for pastoral care, but about the part about not having any particular expectations. I spent a lot of time dithering about whether to join this group or not, and I was always kind of intrigued. I'm very glad that I did. So any talk that Mike badgered me into is absolutely false. It was my choice.
Okay.
But I've been away for the last 5 days on a family celebration of life, so I didn't have a chance. And to be honest, I didn't even notice the attachment. So I haven't read the article. I'm interested in reading both those articles. And as far as pastoral care goes, of course, I'm aware of what pastoral care committees do. I'm aware of what session members are supposed to do, and being in contact with whoever is assigned to them. Not very good at it myself. But I've experienced pastoral care within our church community in a couple of isolated, sort of irregular incidents that you wouldn't call pastoral care, but they were people helped me over the time that I needed. One was a hug, one was a comment that I just needed to hear right at that time. So I'm
Great.
just kind of interested to hear how the discussion goes tonight and next week.
Well, you're going to be trying to answer one of the questions later on in our conversation, most likely.
Sure.
And it's not a problem that you haven't read the material in advance. I would encourage you, if you have time between, now and 2 weeks from now, to at least skim through it, because it may then provide a jumping off point for more questions and conversations. So, the last time around in this module, a whole bunch of people were really interested in grief and pastoral care with grieving people. And so we ended up spending a fair chunk of time in week 2 talking about that. And but it's really focused on what your needs are most directly. So that's where I want to go, and you can haul me back into focus if I go on a tangential wandering, or if something strikes you, please, sort of jump into the conversation. So we're going to start because I tend to like to be a linear person. I like to kind of create a path and walk that. There's I call it an illusion of control when you think you have a plan for something. And one of the things I have discovered routinely is that control is indeed an illusion. We have very little control over anything. But I like the illusion and it gives me comfort. So I do have a bit of a plan for our time together, and it is focused on those 5 questions. So, question 1, why do we care for one another in community? Why do we offer pastoral care? Why is that something that is central to our discipleship, to our following Jesus? And so when I think about that, I have to say that, theologically, we model our pastoral care after Jesus. And so when you think about what you know of the life of Jesus, how did Jesus care for people? So from my perspective, Jesus met people where they were. So when you talk about community and the community outside of your church, Jesus spent way more time with outsiders than with insiders. As a matter of fact, Jesus got into a lot of trouble for hanging with outsiders and not insiders. That's not to say that he did not care deeply for the people who walked with him, who followed him. Jesus, I believe, was the recipient of pastoral care from the people who followed him most closely. But Jesus spent a lot of time in the wider community, and he offered them what they needed, and he always proclaimed Jesus' unconditional love and peace. So when we think about that, caring for one another, pastoral care is both simple in what it is and difficult often in the doing. And when we think about the history of the church, the church, the Christian church, has taken a role in health and in healing for a very long time. Like when you think about it, most of the first hospitals were formed by religious organizations because they believed that health and healing were central to the church's mission. And so, in Halifax, I was born and I gave birth to my children at the Grace Maternity Hospital. It had been founded by a religious organization. The Halifax Infirmary, was run by the Catholic Church for a very long time. And so lots of our churches or lots of our hospitals have that as their basis because it was an important component of the church's mission. And in those hospitals, again, They were reaching out and meeting the needs of the wider community. So even though our hospitals, at least in Halifax, are no longer run by any kind of religious organizations, most of our hospitals still have spiritual care departments of one kind or another. Now, some of us may say that the budgets have been cut far too dramatically and there's not near enough spiritual care or pastoral care available for people who need it. But there is still an aspect of spiritual care. And so, caring for others in community is central and it's grounded in scripture. And so when you think about the stories of Jesus and you think about the call to care for one another in community, are there particular passages of scripture that come to your mind when you think about how Jesus demonstrated care and compassion? What comes to mind for you? Michael?
Uh, just the great commandment to love God, love Jesus, and love your neighbor.
To love your neighbor as yourself?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Gail?
What always comes to mind for me is the passage that, what you do for the least of mine, you do for me.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Others?
I think of Jesus wept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jesus wept, shortest verse of scripture. It's an appropriate and human response to the loss of a loved one. Others? Jerry?
He fed those who needed to be fed,
Mm-hmm.
as
He
he
did.
was fed by so many as he traveled
Absolutely.
on his journey.
Absolutely. When you get a chance to read the background material, in the chapter on it's companions in healing practices of pastoral care. There's an interesting reflection on two models of pastoral care. The model of Jesus as the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. And, the word pastor means shepherd. And also the parable of the Good Samaritan as and in the background material, there is some information that sort of brings up the differences between those two models of pastoral care. And there was a time when, sort of the model of Jesus as the good shepherd laying down his life for the sheep was really one that led to a lot of clergy burnout because pastors gave and gave and gave and gave and never refilled their own cups, which was something that Bonnie was talking about. Like you can just give too much because you have this sense of needing to identify with laying down your life for the sheep. As opposed to the parable of the Good Samaritan, where the Good Samaritan responds to the need, but doesn't give up his own journey. So I'd encourage you to look at that because it really is an interesting shift in pastoral care and something for us to think about. So, the basic underpinning of why we do this is because we model our life of faith after Jesus, and Jesus was consistently caring for others in the community. So we seek to care for each other in community because it reflects that all-inclusive, all-encompassing love of God. And, as scripture says, we love because God first loved us. And so it is a response. And so, when do we engage in this? and I don't want to be flippant in my answer, but we do it when we are invited in to do it, right? We offer pastoral care when there is an invitation or an openness, and when it seems like the right thing to do. And I want to be really clear that we really in our um, in in reaching out to others, in offering pastoral care, one of the things that we need to be clear about is that we can't assume that we know what other people want or need. And I think it's really easy for us to fall into that trap of thinking that we know what someone else must need and just jumping in and offering it. And it comes from the best of intentions. It comes often from a heart of gold. But it can be based on a very faulty assumption that we know without asking. Um, so just something to remember. It's also possible, and I don't want to in any way deny the movement of the Holy Spirit, who is often at work in our interactions one with another, because you might sense that the Spirit is inviting you to reach out to someone. You might sense in another person an openness to a supportive word or a gesture. I think, was it Neil, you who said, you know, you were the recipient of pastoral care, and at one point it was from someone with a hug or just the right word at the right time?
It was. That was me.
Right. And so sometimes there is something that moves within us that goes, I'm gonna offer this to someone else. But I think it's a word of caution to always say we offer pastoral care when we are invited to, when the spirit of openness is there, and that we are cautious in not overstepping our bounds. Um, so when I think about pastoral care and kind of define it, pastoral care refers to a relationship in which one person walks for a while in another person's world. Does that make sense to you? Um, So when we walk with another person in another person's world, attending to the other person to try and appreciate the other and to honor whatever is happening to them at that moment in time. So it is a coming into relationship with someone. It is a walking with them. It's being attentive to their needs. And the other person sets the agenda, right? So that I think is another thing that's really important to remember, that it's not your agenda as the pastoral carer, but it is the agenda of the other person that is most important. And so this, I'm thinking about this in the context of pastoral visiting, right? Or making pastoral connections, especially within a community or maybe with your neighbor or someone in your workplace. So it is that accompanying or being with or being present. Other words, coming alongside, accompanying, companioning, and sometimes it's just for a very little while. And most often, pastoral care happens when someone experiences a difficulty in life. There's an illness, there's a tragedy, there's a death, there's a loss of relationship, and you feel compelled to respond to that, right? Um, and so maybe you choose to make a phone call, you choose to visit, you choose to offer companionship with that person on the journey. And it's interesting because it can happen in scripted ways and also unscripted ways. How many of you have been in a public place and you engage in a conversation with someone. I know some of you, you're great talkers. You would always engage in a conversation with someone. You could be at the local tire store having your tires rotated and you're sitting and you're talking to somebody who's sitting next to you. How often has a complete stranger revealed something that made your pastoral heart just go, oh? Has that ever happened to you? Like I was talking to a woman today that I didn't know, and we just had struck up a conversation, and all of a sudden she's ta telling me about her husband who's just had cancer surgery, and he's now coming home. And that's an invitation into a pastoral response, right? um, with my students, I talk about those things as pastoral encounters, and they're very different from pastoral visits. So I might set up a visit with someone I know who's ill or who's just experienced grief or a tragedy, and I know I'm walking into that environment. But, when I'm sitting at Pudgy Tire waiting for my tire to be plugged, and the person next door that I don't know tells me about their spouse having cancer, well, I didn't plan on that conversation, but what am I called to do in that situation, right? I am called, I think, to care for that person, even though I may never see them again. But how do I listen? How do I invite them, if they want, to tell me more of their story? How do I provide them with a listening ear and a comforting presence? And I bet you it's happened to every one of you. Right? Have you ever had something like that happen where somebody divulged something to you and you didn't know what to say or do, so you didn't say anything? Right? Have you ever been left going, I don't want to go down that road? Because that happens too, right? And we don't know what to say. But listening, being present, offering some level of companionship, whether it's 5 minutes in the grocery store or, an hour-long visit with someone where they really share more. All of those are the places when we offer pastoral care. So, thoughts on that? Times when you've found yourself in those places? Yes?
I I shared before you came on, Susan, that I volunteer for the tartan team at the airport, and I, in my 7, 8 years there, have probably had a couple dozen of different circumstances that would definitely fit into this category of pastoral care, where because people are traveling for all kinds of reasons, and sometimes they're traveling to or from funerals.
Right.
Sometimes they're sending their loved ones home and for the first time being alone after losing a spouse.
Mm-hmm.
And the opportunity to um, be with them in that space at that time and to listen and hear the grief and to hear the absolute loneliness is both heartbreaking and heartwarming, and a blessing to be able to be that individual that person feels comfortable for whatever reason sharing that very, very personal situation at that moment in time. So I have been involved in that because of that work at the airport. It happens to me honestly quite frequently.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm.
And what a gift you are to that person when you provide that listening presence.
Mm.
And really that's a really good segue into kind of our third question of what does it look like? Because Jerry, that is exactly what it looks like. And I have over the years really thought about pastoral care as a ministry of presence. And for those of us who like to do and like to fix and like to make better and like to have answers and like to find solutions, presence is hard because it's not about doing, it's not about fixing, it's not about solving, it's not about giving advice, it's not about making the situation better because how can you make the situation better when somebody has just lost a spouse or a child or been given a diagnosis of cancer? Like, you can't fix that, but you can be present. And that's what it's about. It's about being. It's about being in the moment, as uncomfortable as that place might be. It's about letting that other person know that they're not alone. And it comes out of a strong conviction, I think, that we are called as people of God, as people who follow Jesus, to offer care and comfort, peace and presence to one another. Because God is made known through us. You know, God with skin on is what some people have phrased it as, right? God becomes embodied in the world through us in the way that God was embodied in Jesus in a very human way, right? And so that Spirit of God is embodied in us so that we can be the hands and the feet and the heart of Christ in a world that needs it so, so much. And that really is the only way that God's loving action is made manifest in the world, is through those who choose to embody it. And I'm not saying that only followers of Jesus embody that. I don't want to say that at all, because I believe that in most world religions, folks who are attuned to God, who is love, live that out in a variety of ways. My path, I think our path as those folks who are on this call, is that we have modeled our lives and our love after Jesus, because God does not act independently of creation. And so pastoral care is about helping people realize that no matter what, they are not alone. And I guess we are all United Church folk on this call tonight. And so when we think about the new creed, which is not very new at all, but it begins with those words, right? We are not alone. We live in God's world. And so that invitation to help people understand that, because loneliness is actually an epidemic. There are so many lonely people. And so pastoral care is an opportunity to break down some of those barriers of loneliness and to remind people that they are not alone. And so we are called to embody that Spirit of God. And when we think about that, you know, Jesus calmed storms, right? We have beautiful biblical stories of Jesus calming oceans, but it wasn't just oceans that Jesus calmed. Jesus calmed people's spirits and grounded them and centered them. And so I think we are also in our pastoral care called to be that oasis of calm in the midst of a storm. We're called to be a non-anxious presence. When people are grieving, when people are experiencing the kind of trauma that comes from ill health or tragedy, there is an anxiety that that happens in that. And I'm sure you've experienced that in your own personal lives, right? There's an anxiousness that comes in some of life's experiences. And you don't need somebody who will feed that anxiety, right? Anxiety breeds anxiety. And so when we're offering pastoral care, we want to be the non-anxious presence, the person that grounds. And the way we do that, I think, is to know that we are grounded in God ourselves. So that's where our own sort of awareness is really important. And being calm and being centered as we approach other people. So, again, just to kind of reiterate, our role is not to have answers. It's not to fix things. It's to be. It's to be fully present, fully human, fully with the other. And that demands a lot of us to be present to people in the midst of crises and to be grounded in that. There's again, in our package of material that I has been circulated, there's some cues around listening, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that. How do we enter into deep listening? How do those of us who like to talk too much learn to keep our mouths shut? That is sometimes difficult, right? And I know it was certainly something that I had to work at and still work at to sometimes say, Susan, just be quiet, just listen. Some of us aren't very comfortable with silence. And yet, if we can't be comfortable with silence, we might not leave space for the other person to think about what's happening for them. So we'll maybe look at a few of those resources around deep listening and how to keep yourself grounded and open, how to ask inviting sort of questions so that people can sort out for themselves the answers to their own questions. Because again, we're not going to solve other people's problems. So again, kind of want to throw it back to you to think about in your own life experience. Can you think of a time when you felt truly listened to, when you experienced pastoral care? Has there been what moments in your life, and how did it happen? What did the person do or not do when somebody has come alongside you in a moment of difficulty? Because we often learn from our own experiences of pastoral care that either was good or not good. And I can tell you stories of both. Gail,
Do I have the mic on this time?
you do.
Well, you'll know this one, Susan, because you were the person. You knew how very close I was to my father and how devastating that was for me. And you were the person that was there, listening and talking, but you helped me through that. And for that, I'll always be grateful. And I'm sure other people have similar situations that they have special people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks, Gail.
I think back to when, it is 48 years ago when my first husband died. And it was the padre that came and told me that Wayne had died. And the padre came back every couple of weeks to visit. And one of his visits, he said to me, "You must be lonely." And I could not put a word to what I was feeling, but to have him say to me, "lonely," it was exactly what I was experiencing, and having the word, because there were so many different emotions that I was going through. And having that word loneliness helped,
Okay.
because it put a word to one of the things that I was experiencing
Great.
at that time. So pastoral care was there for me.
So it was the right word for you at the
Yes.
moment. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Michael, I think you were going to say something.
Yes. So when my practice wife left me in 2009, I was it was a rough period for me, and I ended up going on stress leave from work. And I reached out to a friend of mine. She was doing her residency in a place called Neels Harbor, Cape Breton. And I reached out to her, and she invited me to come up and spend a few days, at her place in Neels Harbor. And I don't think we did a lot of talking, but she was there, and we went on hikes along the shoreline, and I think it was what I needed um, to sort of regain my footing, so to speak. Another example, and again, it doesn't really involve listening, but when I had to sell my house, there was a lot of work that needed to be done to make it saleable. And I had to get rid of a lot of stuff. And my friend Neil Williams, he showed up with his family in tow, and they helped with the painting and anything else that needed doing in that mess of a house, and helped me set up yard sales and a driveway. And again, there wasn't a lot of discussion, or I wasn't talking about things. It was a very traumatic time for me, because I had a lot of possessions that I felt very strongly about, and I was getting rid of them because I just wouldn't have the space for them. But Neil and his whole family were there for me, and I'll always remember that.
And sometimes caring for one another in community is embodied in those kinds of actions, right? Um, but I would hope that Neil didn't just assume you needed him to do those things, but that he was responding, right? And maybe he offered and you accepted. And so again, pastoral care is lived out in a variety of ways. And it sounds like in your earlier illustration that your friend offered you space, right? And offered you that kind of healing space of nature for hiking. You didn't need a lot of words, but there was space to be and space for your own soul to heal a little bit. Um, I think that's really important. Um, One of the things that, when I think about some of the horrible situations that people find themselves in, there are no words, right? And sometimes the best thing you can say to somebody who is in the midst of unspeakable tragedy, the best thing you can say is, I have no words, right? But my heart is with you in this tender time, right? Because there's lots of situations where no words are ever going to change the reality of the trauma or the tragedy. And just to say that can mean a tremendous amount to people. Just to be, again, that ministry of presence. Um, so, Jerry?
Susan, you said pastoral care comes in many forms and a very quick, very brief, but very unique form of pastoral care. When our first daughter was born, Shallon, she was born with Down syndrome, and I remember driving home from the hospital after having been with Donna on a few visits over the course of 3 or 4 days before we were able to have Shallon brought home. And I remember driving home myself. Music has always been a very important part of my life, and I had the radio on and feeling overwhelmed and uncertain about so many things with this new challenge in my life. On the radio came James Taylor's "You've Got a Friend."
Uh,
I heard the words to that song so many times, but that evening they took on a pastoral presence and comfort that I can't even begin to describe. So interesting how pastoral care can come to us
mhm.
without having spoken a word to anyone.
Thanks for sharing that, Jerry. That's powerful. And you're right, music has a capacity to touch our hearts in a whole lot of ways. And I know certainly that's one of the things as people are moving through the various parts of grief is that music will almost always trigger or can an emotional reaction. And you'll hear a piece of music and it just the tears just well up from nowhere. And it's a good thing to be aware of, and I always try and remind folks of that who are going through grieving situations to, don't think that you're kind of losing it completely when you hear a piece of music and all of a sudden the tears come because, it just does. And likewise, if you are sort of musically inclined or you like music, there will be pieces of music that will probably calm you and settle you and ground you. And that's really important as well. For me personally, there's a piece of music, and you may all know it, Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, right? And I often think about that when I know that I'm moving into a situation where I know I'm going to offer pastoral care, that sense of being grounded, in order to be open to the Spirit. So I want to just kind of move us along because I'm aware that we're kind of an hour into our time. Um, but thinking about, and we've already sort of landed on some of this, like where does pastoral care happen? Where does it take place? And I think we've all sort of covered that territory that it happens anywhere and everywhere. It happens in the airport when Jerry is connecting with strangers who are traveling. It happens when you're reaching out to a neighbor. It happens in the grocery store. Pastoral care happens whenever people's paths cross in all kinds of places. And, within our church communities, we sometimes try and have structures in place where we set up pastoral visits where we try and reach out to one another. But we're not always good at that. And sometimes people don't know when there's a pastoral care crisis. And I know that you're representatives of, I guess, what, 4 different pastoral charges? Port Wallace, Woodlawn, Milford, First United, and Furrow. Um, and sometimes we're not good at within the church at sort of knowing when there's something happening that we should respond to. Um, and people get hurt by that sometimes. But a pastoral care team can certainly help with spreading that responsibility more widely and being able to reach out. So I don't know what your experience is. Does Woodlawn has a pastoral care team?
Yes, they do.
Okay. And do you know how they function?
Yes, I'm a past pastoral care coordinator. So
Right.
the team is made up of probably as many as a dozen people.
Okay.
A specific committee, a group of individuals within the team do specific visitations to both hospital when requested,
Okay.
or to the Parklands and Oakwood and those places. We also have a telephone team,
Okay.
committee of that group that make calls out when they're made aware of people who have pastoral needs. We also have a card committee, and the card committee uh, will send out a card to someone who has lost someone, a
Hmm.
family member, friend.
Great.
We also send out cards of thanks when somebody does something of significance within the church. We're quick to address those issues, of loss and grief, and they're very important. But we also need to acknowledge pastoral care is thanking people and sharing with them how
Absolutely.
blessed we are to have them and to have them provide the resources they provide to us by way of their time or talents or treasures. So yeah,
Great.
it's a pretty deep committee.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great stewardship there. I
Yeah.
had to say that.
Yeah.
Thanking people, we don't do enough of it.
Absolutely. No, it's really an important component of that. And at Port Wallace, is there a pastoral care team?
There is. There's, I believe, 4 or 5 individuals that work with Mary Lynn White on pastoral care um, issues, or calling people or contacting, visiting, that sort of thing. Also, there's, I believe, a card committee starting up. It
Okay,
was mentioned just earlier. So
great.
The thing about Port Wallace is that just excuse me.
Oh,
what is the environment?
froze, Barb.
Yeah.
You're back.
Oh, that's because Wally was trying to get me on the other line on the anyways. The thing about Port Wallace is that um, we kid around and we say when we meet we eat. Yeah. And the pastoral care committee, I don't know how they know it, but they spend a lot of time feeding, and not just their people's soul, but their, they when I was ill, there were people brought food. I know my father died. People baked and brought
Mhm.
food, and um, I also know that among the people that are here, people helped each other. I mean,
Right.
I had surgery, and Neil's wife and Neil supported us. We shared what we had. There's just, and Mike's wife is very is a loving, very loving person. A hug from Sharon certainly
Right.
makes all the difference. And sometimes that's the, like they're not part of the official committee, but they they care in a way that they care. And
Right.
that makes a difference. Yep.
It does. It absolutely does make a difference. And so, there are a whole variety of ways of doing pastoral care. And I think there is real wisdom in congregations having pastoral care teams so that that responsibility is shared. And, the gift of a phone call, the gift of a card, the gift of food, all of those are very tangible ways of saying that we care and that we're with you, that we are companions on the journey. So we break bread, that Jesus broke bread all the time with people. It was one of the ways that he stayed connected. And so having folks both who are trained and part of a pastoral care team who feel comfortable walking into hospitals and visiting and possibly praying with people, engaging in those deeper spiritual conversations is important. Having people who know when to show up with a casserole or freshly baked muffins or those sorts of things also, equally important. And so I would just, yeah, encourage you to be thinking about all of those things. One of the ways that Cole Harbor was certainly blessed was with a parish nurse for many years. And our parish nurse was really helpful at being able to combine her medical understanding and her ability to come alongside people and to do the kind of pastoral care for folks who were, dealing with dementia or dealing with cancer diagnoses or whatever, that was just a really, really important piece. And really coming alongside people, as we've talked about it in so many ways, is really, really important. Being able to listen to what other people are saying. So I'm wondering about sort of thinking about how how you feel when you find yourself in certain situations. Do you struggle for words? Do you find yourself um, kind of, oh, what do I do next in this situation? Are there particular sort of situations that from a pastoral perspective you would find difficult? Have you had, experiences? I know some of you are doing funeral ministry. So Gail, you've been involved in that. Jerry, um, how do you feel about that ability to offer pastoral care to grieving people? Are there areas where that's sort of difficult for you? Do you have any questions about that? Um, Gail?
I don't really have any questions about that. Like I find being able to walk with people in their grief
Mm-hmm.
is fulfilling for me. Okay. It
Nice.
allows me to believe, okay, that it's an important aspect of sharing God's love.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't often have to say anything, okay? A pat on the arm or a glass of water because they've been talking forever or whatever. It just shows people that they're not alone, that
Yeah.
people do care about them. To me, it's a very rewarding aspect of the of funeral ministry.
Right. Yeah. Do any of you, we talked a little bit, or somebody mentioned sort of listening skills. And so I'm wondering if you've got any particular questions around that. In the material that that's been sent to you, there are some recommendations around improving your listening skills and those sorts of things. So it's harder to do on a Zoom call because we're all in little boxes, and so it's much more difficult to engage in this in the way that I would if we were in a room. And so thinking about listening skills and eye contact, right? How do we make people comfortable in conversation by the way that we look into their eyes as I look around my Zoom screen to try and see you? What are the words that we use? What's the kind of tone? What's the invitation that we use in conversation to set up a space that is sort of pastoral and holy and that allows the person to know that you are really, really attentive to them? And what gets in the way of that? What gets in the way of being attentive to another person? That's my question to you. And I'm going to lift this up, right? Our phones often get in the way of us being attentive to one another. So how do we put those things aside so we can truly, truly listen to one another? What else gets in the way of us being attentive to one another? Gail?
Sometimes I think we're so focused on what it is that we're doing, and that becomes the all important thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we forget to focus on the people that we're doing it for,
Mm.
the intent of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's difficult to haul yourself back from that when you are an organized person and intent on making sure that everything goes the way that you think it should go, when
Mm-hmm.
people don't really care if it's perfect or not. Okay, as long as you feed them and there's something to drink and there's napkins, like, they don't really care if it's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
But you focus, well, I don't say you, but for me, sometimes I get so wrapped up in the focus of making sure that it's all just as it should be.
Mm-hmm.
I I forget the real important part, and that's the people.
Right. Yep. Yeah. Michael.
I'm a fixer, and so all too often I don't listen to understand. I listen to answer,
Yes.
and it's something that I've been working on for a long time to try and get better at that. And another thing that works against me is the urge to talk. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so those are the two things that I really struggle with. The
Mm-hmm.
phone is a something you can physically put aside, um, but the other stuff is internal
Yeah.
baggage.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It very much is. And how to stay sort of focused and present on the person. I mean, I struggle sometimes with, my mind is wandering through like it's jumping ahead to the next things that I need to do and not staying focused on what is in the moment. And that's really important. I'm going to sort of walk us through because I know some of you haven't had a chance to look at the material. So there are some recommendations in the material to improve your listening skills. And so the very first one, Michael, you've already identified, is to share the talk time, to not monopolize the conversation. And, we all know people who talk nonstop, right? They just talk nonstop. And so in good listening skills, you need to listen. One mouth, two ears. So to listen more. But, how do you listen? You listen with attention, not with your mind being distracted. Um, and that's kind of the second thing on this list, is to check your worries at the door, because if you're preoccupied with something else, you won't be listening attentively. And I often have to check myself on that. I don't know whether any of the rest of you do, but my mind can wander, and it can wander to something else, and then you realize I'm not really listening to you. That used to happen with my children, and they would call me on it periodically. Mom, you're not listening to me. And they were right. I was, my head was nodding, but my mind was not engaged. And when we are about good pastoral care, our whole body needs to be engaged in that. And so to be focused. Um, and, as we're listening attentively to people, um, there is a place for asking appropriate questions, questions that help the person elicit their own answers, right? We're not coming to be fixers. We're not coming with answers, but we can ask questions that are appropriate, that show that we're listening attentively. And we can listen to what's not being said, because sometimes you can learn as much from what somebody leaves out than what they're saying. And, I know that I have been caught in some really interesting pastoral places, thinking in particular about being called when somebody died, and it wasn't a family I knew, but I was the funeral home, calls, and you're invited to meet with a family. And so you go to meet with folks that you've never met before, and you're trying to get a sense of what's really happening in this family dynamic. And it's just so clear by what they're not saying that there is something deep that's just not coming out, and you have to, walk that quite carefully to just sort of understand what's going on, what's not being said, and what do I need to think about in response to that. Um, eye contact, looking closely at the speaker, being aware of their body language. And that's certainly, again, it's harder to do on a Zoom call because we're only kind of seeing ourselves from the neck up or whatever. But when people sort of sit with their arms crossed tightly, what does that tell you about, what's going on with them internally? Can you read body language to have a sense of whether you're making a good connection, or whether you're not making a connection? What kind of body language are you exhibiting? Are you connecting people eye to eye? We have to be careful about touch, simply because we don't want to invade people's physical space without their permission. But sometimes, an arm on a shoulder, a hug given with permission, those are all powerful pastoral ways of being, and they communicate that we are listening intently to what's unfolding. What other things can I think about with that? Being open-minded as you're engaging in conversation, not getting drawn into arguments, but really being open to what people need to say to you. You know, sometimes people just need to vent, and they don't need answers. They don't need solutions. They just need a listening ear. And you can give people the greatest gift pastorally when you provide that space for them to just vent. And you'll sometimes go away and think, I didn't do a darn thing. And they'll go, oh, thank you so much. That was so helpful. And you go, I don't think I did very much. And maybe you didn't do much, but you were present. And being present is just so absolutely important. So we have about what, half an hour or so left. And I'm not I'm wondering again, sort of what's most helpful for you. One of the other resources that I shared is a think before you speak resource. I don't know about you, but I've heard some what I consider to be pretty pretty horrible theology given in response to tragedy, at least theology that I have not found helpful when I've heard words like, everything happens for a reason. Have you heard that? So I think, or God only takes the best, or there's probably a whole lot of other examples, or what's the God doesn't give you more than you
You
can
can handle. Bull crap.
So, Barb, that's not a
I
helpful pastoral response.
No.
yeah, yeah. I just wish he didn't have so much confidence in me.
Ah, there you go. There you go. So I mean, I'd like to let's look at some of those things, shall we, for a few minutes? Like, what does how does that make you feel? Barb, you responded pretty fast to that comment.
Oh, that one drives me absolutely bonkers.
Okay.
Like what a terrible thing to say to somebody whose child is dying. Like, how does that, or is very ill, or like there's, or your marriage is falling apart, and
Mhm.
like, no, how does that help? That God wanted me in this thing, or you know, and especially when you, I I have been in that position, but I wouldn't say it to somebody because most likely you already feel like you've got more than you can handle at that moment, anyways.
Right.
And you're looking for uh, rest, you're looking for a way out, you're looking for a way to survive, not, and to hear that God is doing this to you.
Right.
Because I don't believe a loving God is doing this to you. Things happen and that's the way it is, but
Mm-hmm.
God isn't doing that to you.
Right.
But people say that everything that God causes everything. Well, people cause a lot of stupidity all by themselves, in my opinion, anyways.
Yeah.
I like to use the terminology, what can I do to help?
What can I do to help? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I
That's a
find
really good question to ask, Gail. Absolutely. Because what does that do? It puts the power back in the hand of the person, right? It doesn't assume that you know what they need.
how could you really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I always find that is they'll either open up or they'll shut you down.
Right.
And then you know what direction you need to go.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's a really good question to ask, and then to be able to take your guidance from that person, right? Um, yeah, that's a really good thing. But I want to circle back because I think our theology really does influence the way we approach pastoral care or caring for one another. And so, if our theology says that God is responsible for everything, then we're going to react in different ways. And so, if we believe that there are things that happen that are outside of God's control, I have been known to say in public places, um, shit happens. And it does, right? And I will never blame God for those tragic events. I am never going to make God responsible for the baby who, dies of SIDS, right? How could that possibly be helpful? And how I could not follow a God that I thought had anything to do with children dying of cancer, right? But I wholeheartedly believe that God works consistently and always to bring good out of tragedy, right? That for me is the power of resurrection, that out of death comes life, that God is always saying, I will continue to bring life out of just crazy, horrible places. And so, because I believe that, then there are certain other kind of theological comments that don't make any sense to me, because I think people, and this is one of the places where I think it's really important for us as as church people or followers of Jesus. When you think about, a lot of you talked as we started, about the community. How do we relate to people outside of our church? I think lots of people have a sense that God must be responsible for things, right? Because they've not ever really considered a different option. And so I will, sometimes someone will say to me, well, they will parrot some of what I consider to be that bad theology. Well, everything happens for a reason. And I say, well, I'm not 100% sure of that that's how it is. And then people stop and go, oh, really? Or, well, God doesn't give us more than we can handle. And it's like, well, let's talk about that. Are you really sure that's the case? Is God the one who is giving you this, or is God there to help you handle it? And I think there's a lot of differences in the way we attend to those things. And how do we step into those places to be the bearer of light and good news and pastoral care? Um,
I think sometimes, Susan, that language like that uh, becomes a filler when we don't know what to say and we're uncomfortable with silence. And I
yes.
also think that it's a reflection of our own fear, because if life really is that chaotic and that sort of awful thing can happen to you, well, what can happen to me? So if I can blame it on something rather than life being, to a certain degree, chaotic by nature, if I
Right.
can blame it on something or someone, that feels a little bit more controlled. And so we also need to, I think, be aware of how we feel about a particular situation. If we have the opportunity to prepare, like how do we feel about these things and get ourselves straight before we can presume to speak to another, or rather listen to another.
Absolutely, Ross. Yeah. Michael and then Jerry.
So I'm I really appreciate the theology that is present in songs like Jesus has no body now but ours,
Mm-hmm.
and go and make a difference. There's a stanza from the New Creed that I absolutely love, and it's we're called to be the church, to celebrate God's presence, to live with respect in creation, to love and serve others, to seek justice and resist evil, and to proclaim Jesus crucified and risen, our judge and our hope. And that says to me that, it's our job, when we say, oh, the famine is terrible, why doesn't God do something about it? It's well, yes. Why don't we do something about it? And I really think that is important, at least for me.
Absolutely, Michael. And that really is that sense of caring, right? Of moving out into the world, of being the presence of Christ. Yeah. Jerry.
One of the ways I try and approach those situations when people are despondent and angry, and say those things, why would a God do this, and why would a God allow this to happen?
Mm-hmm.
I've found for me it best not to acknowledge the words, but to acknowledge the emotion,
Mm-hmm.
and to say, I hear the despair and I hear the heartbreak in
Mm-hmm.
your words, and know that know that I'm concerned for you, and I'm here for you, and I'm here to
Mm-hmm.
listen to you. And more often than not, will say something that maybe they really don't want an answer to what it is they're saying. They
Mm-hmm.
simply want us to acknowledge the emotion of what it is they're experiencing. I find that helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Jerry. And it can be hard to listen to people's pain, right? It can be hard to listen to that emotion. Um, Bonnie, I think it was you who talked a little bit about, sort of boundaries and how we can we can get caught in situations where we feel like we are needing to give and give and give. And so, how do we, sort of put boundaries around how much of ourselves we can put into those places? And I think, it takes a lot of time and energy, emotional energy, to listen deeply to somebody who is in a really difficult place. And we have to kind of respect our own needs to recoup. Um, so I think that's important. When you think about the story of the Good Samaritan, the Good Samaritan responds to the needs of the traveler who has been beaten and found by the side of the road, stops the journey that he's on, attends to the person, takes him to the innkeeper, pays out of pocket to make sure that the person is cared for, and then goes on. And we have chances are the Good Samaritan never saw that person again, right? But they met their needs in that moment, as opposed to saying, oh my, I can't carry on with my journey. I need to, just stay and be attentive to this person and sacrifice everything. And we've all probably encountered people who um, seem to, what's the right way to phrase it?
There
Uh,
isn't one.
Thanks, Ross. but who almost rejoice in their own martyrdom about giving so much of themselves for other people. And that's a really poor, poor model of pastoral care. And I think it's often done with good intention. And I would say, it probably was done out of a kind of a theology of self-giving. But, Jesus is Jesus, God is God, and we are not. And one of the sort of things I used to talk with my pastoral care team a lot was that we have to remember that, God is God and we are not. And that, we can care, we don't cure, right? We care deeply for people, but you know, we are not God, and we work within the limitations of our, beautiful and messy humanness. And we offer what we have with the best of intentions, and sometimes we do it well, and sometimes we screw it up. And the good news is that God is always there to kind of forgive us, encourage us, set us out forth again. And we do that pastoral care with a deep and tender heart. But we are always also learning how to do it better. And, I think about the fine people that were in my first pastoral charge in Rawdon, and how much they taught this very young minister about what it meant to be in ministry and to do pastoral care. And I don't know that I would want to go back and think about probably some of the atrocious mistakes I made in those early years, but I learned. And we continue to learn in this venture of life and community, and the life of discipleship and life of caring. And I think it's such it's such an important aspect of who we are and what we're called to do, and to have that attitude of deep care for people is just so important. Thinking about the sort of various groups that you sort of interact with, or that we think about, sort of pastoral care. There's pastoral care for children, who have a very different way of thinking about the world. Um, Pastoral care for young adults, pastoral care for people who are grieving, pastoral care for people who are ill. Like, there's just so many different places where we are called to be. And one of the places that was always concerned about in ministry was pastoral care with children, especially around grief. Because we so often want to protect our children, and often we're we don't do a particularly good job of caring for children, because we're often trying to protect them rather than allowing them to ask their own questions. And I don't know, in your funeral ministry, Gail or Jerry, whether you've had very many interactions with children in those environments, but I just think, helping parents and grandparents deal with grief with their children and grandchildren is a really, really important thing that the church can do, and that we can do as pastoral care providers. I remember doing a pastoral care workshop on grief a long, long time ago, and the woman who was leading it said, you have two choices when it comes to grief and children. You either can help children grieve, or you can hinder their grief. But you can't take grief away, right? And you cannot, you're either going to help them process it in helpful ways, or you're going to hinder what that grieving process looks like. And so, I've always been a proponent that death is part of life and that our children need to understand that. And we need to let them ask their questions about death and dying. And we need to be supportive. We need to share our own kind of understanding of what that is. And children are resilient. They ask their questions, and if they're invited into the conversation, they're pretty amazing teachers, frankly. So I don't know whether you have any questions or interests or concern around that. Gail?
We had a funeral several weeks ago. It was a 25-year-old girl
Mm.
who had taken her life. And so the funeral home had called Kevin, and he did it. There was like 250 people there. It was probably the longest funeral that I had ever been to, because it went on for about 2 hours or more.
Mm.
But there were 12 young people, okay? Like I say young people, young adults, okay? And they spoke. And it was a beautiful service. And then they came down to the reception. And they weren't about what she did. They were about who she was.
Mm.
That was the whole thing. And they were jovial and sad.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There was young people, there were older people, but it was a community of people who loved this young woman.
Mm-hmm.
And it was probably if there is such a thing as a nice funeral, okay?
Funerals can be lovely.
Um, it it was uplifting, to be honest. Okay, like the young people would come and they would eat and they would say, "Oh, I can't believe the food that's here. Food that's here." Okay, and her parents came and said, like, "We don't know how to thank you for what you've done for our daughter." Okay,
Mhm.
like to the point where the younger members of the family, okay, stayed until everything was over and insisted on helping us clean up the hall.
Mm.
So, I mean, it just made you feel that you were part of their grief, their
Mhm.
happiness. It was awesome, okay? Like, to me,
Yeah.
may not have been to everybody, but to me, it was.
Yeah. But it sounds, Gail, like that in the giving of the food and the time and the attention and the space, that they were moving on in their journey of healing as well, that the opportunity to tell stories and to be fed and to be in community were all really important.
And they expressed that.
Yeah. How
They
lovely.
did. Even the young people, okay,
Yeah.
like even her friends, it was not something I had witnessed before.
Mm.
Not that there weren't other nice funerals, but
Right.
this for a young person was very, very meaningful, I thought.
So there was, in that respect, I'm going to guess that those young people probably had no church connections. And so you were doing kind of pastoral care in the wider community through that pastoral care at a time of death and grief.
They had gone to Woodlawn many, many years ago,
Hmm.
okay, as a young family, but hadn't participated in any church in a number of years.
Hmm.
And when the funeral home recommended that they called a minister at Woodlawn United because it had a large enough church to
Right.
facilitate the number of people they felt was going to be there. It was very comforting to them. I mean, the parents said that.
It's excellent. Thank you.
I hope I'm not monopolizing time, but for me, the most challenging pastoral circumstance in my life to this point was in the passing of my mom. My oldest daughter, Shallon, who I've said earlier has Down syndrome, had a relationship with my mom that was so tight, I can't even begin to describe it. And I'll never forget leaving the hospital after mom passed. And I looked at my wife and I said, this is going to be one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life,
Right.
to tell Shallon that her grandmother passed and to know that my emotion was probably going to be as strong as hers.
Right.
But what an incredible conversation, and we cried together, and I she is cognitively, she's pretty bright young lady. We're very fortunate on the scale. Shallon is very bright, but definitely the biggest challenge, and I know for many families who have children with mental disabilities, death is so profoundly challenging when someone close passes. And that one for me has been the hardest to date.
Yeah. Yeah. But it also sounds, Jerry, like you entered it with an open heart and a willingness to be vulnerable yourself in that
Yes.
space,
Yeah.
right? And I think when we're talking about helping our children deal with their own grief, our own ability to be vulnerable in our own is really important, right? Because children pick up, and I'm thinking especially of younger children, but children pick up the anxieties of the adults around them. And so if the adults won't talk about the fact that, Nanny died, or, my Paul was grumpy, that's what he was to the grandchildren. And yes, it's hard. It's incredibly hard when you're dealing with your own grief to facilitate the grief of your children. But if you won't talk about it, then what they pick up is you can't talk about death, that it's scary, that it's a forbidden subject that you can't talk about. And that just hinders children so deeply. So, I have a whole series of books, both for adults and children, that I have found to be really helpful for helping to explain, grief and death to children, and how important it is that we make that space, right? Because death is part of life, and it just shocks me at how ill prepared most people are to deal with the reality of death and grief. And, you know, nobody gets out of this world alive. So we're all going to have to deal with it. And some folk have had to deal with far more of it than others. But when you are a pastoral person, when you're part of a church community, you're going to be walking that road with people who are grieving. And I would say that, probably the most pastoral care that happens is around grief and loss, and whether that's the loss of people, loss of job, loss of relationship, loss of identity. That's where we find ourselves most often. And so, how do we do that? And certainly there's lots and lots of good resources around grief and helping people understand that, helping us understand our own grief and what that looks like, but then being that supportive presence that accompanies people and walks with people, and recognizing that, you know, in especially in church communities, if we're thinking about pastoral care there, that, you know, grief is a long process, and often people don't recognize that. And you know, because everybody else's world goes on, where the person who has had that significant loss, their world has changed forever. And it's really, I think, an important role of certainly a pastoral care team in a church community can be to sort of recognize those, to be attentive to dates and times, especially, you know, if you're supporting somebody in the first year or two after someone has died, to be, you know, to be aware of important dates, whether that's the birthday of the person who died, to go, this is going to be a hard day for you, and I just want you to know that I've remembered, or the anniversary of a death, to be able to say, you know, I know this is likely going to be a day that's difficult, and I'm remembering you. Those are important things to do, important ways of communicating care to our wider community. So, you know, I just think there are other, you know, at Cole Harbor Woodside, one of the things we did was to certainly in the first year is to remember on Mother's Day and Father's Day how hard those days can be if your mom or your dad has died, or you've had a child who died, right? Like those Hallmark dates are really can be really difficult. And so just to get a card from the church that says, you know, we know in our society Mother's Day is seen as a lovely day, and we know that for you, this might be difficult. And so we're just reaching out to let you know that we have remembered. Sometimes it doesn't take much to communicate the pastoral care and the good intentions of a community. And you can do that within your church community. You can also just remember it amongst your own circle of friends and acquaintances and family members, to go, oh, this is probably going to be a hard day. I should reach out and just acknowledge that. What other things would you like to? We're almost coming to the end of our time, and I recognize I have been prattling on lots over the last 2 hours, and I would really appreciate a sense of what you'd like to focus on in 2 weeks when we kind of come back together again. And you may not know that yet because you haven't had a lot of time to think about it. But you know, I'm happy to pivot in whatever directions are helpful, what aspects of caring you'd like to address. This was kind of a big circular overview, and we went in a few different directions, and I acknowledge that my time, like my body is still on Ireland time, so I am probably not the most focused, and I may well be more focused in 2 weeks. But you know, this really is your time. You have chosen to step into this program, and maybe we'll have a few more people join us in 2 weeks. But yeah, if you can give me any direction of where you'd like to go, what's helpful, what's not helpful.
Would it be possible to talk about pastoral care in relation to MAID?
Oh, yep,
Yep.
sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And certainly as we move into the next couple of weeks, if you think of anything, please don't hesitate to drop me an email. You all have my address now. and I'll be glad to pass that along to Susan. And because some of us, me, need time to think about stuff and process it before we have a response. And so please don't think that this is your only opportunity to get your question or your interest in.
Absolutely. And because you are the first sort of, this is the first session, I didn't have the opportunity to ask Ross, so what can you tell me about this group? What are they like? What are their, sort of interests or needs? And so it's like, well, we're just getting to know each other, and I'm grateful to have crossed paths with some of you and know some of you quite well. So that's really helpful.
Jerry, yeah.
I think the other topic that would be helpful, MAID certainly is one that I'd be interested in our flushing out a bit more, but also palliative care.
Ah, sure. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Happy to look at those things. Anything else? Okay.
All right then. Well, Susan, thank you very much for from whatever time zone you're reporting in from. Thank you for stepping in and kicking off our sessions for the year. We appreciate that very much. We appreciate your wisdom and your vulnerability, your willingness to share all of that. And we look forward to 2 weeks hence. And meanwhile, folks, blessings on your journey. Thank you for joining in this process. And please be in touch if there's anything that you need or want to share or inquire about. But meanwhile, blessings on your discipleship pilgrimage.
Absolutely. Thanks for spending time with me
Thank
tonight, folks.
you.
Thanks,
All
Thank
right.
you very much.
thanks all.
See you tomorrow, Ross.
Thank you, everyone.
Guys,
Bye.
Thank you both for your leadership. Good night.
thank
Night.
you.
Good night.
Do I sign out of this?